Good evening. I am Michael Dutton. I'm Bridgewater's town manager, and I would like to welcome you to Bridgewater's Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan public hearing. Today is Tuesday, July 21st, 2020. And as this is a public hearing, we'll be answering any questions this evening and certainly accepting written testimony and comments now through the close of business on Tuesday, August 4th, 2020. So that's 2 weeks from now. Before I introduce the panelists for this evening's hearing, I have several items to go through. One is a disclosure. Pursuant to Governor Baker's March 12th, 2020 order suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law, MGL Chapter 30A, Section 18, and the Governor's March 15th, 2020 order imposing strict limitations on the number of people that may gather in one place. This meeting of this hearing, will be conducted via remote participation to the greatest extent possible. There will be no in-person attendance permitted. This hearing is being recorded and will be available on the town's YouTube page as well as the town's webpage. The draft Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan itself can be found on the town website at www.bridgewaterma.org by clicking on Government, then Public Works, then Water Pollution Control, and then finally the Bridgewater CWMP report. Or you may schedule an appointment by calling the town manager's office at 508-697-0919 or emailing townmanager@bridgewaterma.org. And I'll go over those again at the end of the hearing. Just a note, planning for wastewater treatment is a critical challenge for every community in Massachusetts, and Bridgewater is no different. Our single wastewater treatment plant protects public health, protects our water resources, and often governs our growth and development plans. Building and maintaining wastewater treatment facilities is a considerable financial demand. It's therefore obviously important that decisions are made on the planning, design, construction, and maintenance of our wastewater facility to be environmentally sound and certainly as cost efficient as possible. Our local decisions must also accommodate the settlement agreement that resulted from our filing suit against the United States Environmental Protection Agency and the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. That suit was filed to oppose what we saw as an overly stringent timeline that these agencies mandated for us to comply with new wastewater discharge quality standards. Both agencies have granted us, under the settlement, have granted us an additional number of years to satisfy these new discharge standards. This hearing is one of the steps required to finalize approval of our comprehensive wastewater management plan. A finalized CWMP is also a requirement for state revolving fund financing for required improvements to the wastewater plant, and securing those funds can mean very favorable interest rates on borrowings and possible principal forgiveness on loans and bonding. So with that introduction, let me introduce the panelists. As I mentioned, I am Michael Dutton, Bridgewater Town Manager, and I'll be serving as the moderator this evening. Tony Solmonti is Bridgewater's Finance Director and joins us as a presenter of the financial portions of this presentation. Jonas Kozlowskis is Bridgewater's Water and Sewer Superintendent. And finally, Gina Cortese and Kent Nichols, both engineers with Weston and Sampson, will be leading most of this presentation. Since the presentation covers a lot of ground, I would ask that you save your questions to the end. You can submit written questions by clicking the Q&A tab at the lower part of your screen, or you can certainly electronically raise your hand and ask questions, and I will unmute you in order to ask your questions. And with that, I will turn it over to Gina Cortese, who will walk us through the first piece of the presentation. Gina?
Great, thank you, Michael. So we'll start just by going through what the agenda is for this presentation, and Michael did a great job of introducing those of us who are on the call presenting. Then we'll start with just a quick background of what exactly is a comprehensive wastewater management plan and what was the goal of putting one together for Bridgewater. What exactly does wastewater, this wastewater system and collection system for wastewater in Bridgewater look like currently? What sort of key planning issues are coming down the pike in the future for Bridgewater, and how might the town try to meet those key challenges? How to then finance and fund those recommended changes to meet those challenges, and what's next as far as moving forward with the comprehensive wastewater management plan. Of course, as Michael mentioned, we'll have time for questions and comments afterwards, as well as other ways for you all to submit questions and comments after the presentation. So, comprehensive wastewater management plan. What exactly is that? So a comprehensive wastewater management plan, and you'll hear it referred to for the rest of the presentation as a CWMP, is a planning document that towns use to look forward 20 years into the future and try to evaluate what the current and future wastewater needs are for a town. So for Bridgewater, obviously right now we're looking at what sort of wastewater needs are there in town, and how might the town make changes in their current systems to be able to meet those future needs. So what we did, Weston and Sampson, working with the town, is we looked at the current setup, what the future needs are. We're going to talk mostly about the wastewater system tonight, but we also looked at the stormwater and drinking water portions of the water system in wastewater, in Bridgewater. And then looking at all of those needs, we were able to evaluate some potential solutions and present those as recommended projects and solutions moving forward for the town. So we started with, as we do for all of these, looking at what exactly is the wastewater system currently in Bridgewater. So the town of Bridgewater currently has about 2,300 properties that are sewered. The network itself is aging. It's almost 100 years, approximately 100 years old in age. And like most towns in Massachusetts, the collection system itself is subject to flows that are not strictly sewer, that come in through rainwater, cracks in pipes, and other illicit connections that get into the sewer system that create extraneous flows within the system. What exactly does that look like on a map? It's a bit difficult to see here, but you can see this is a map of Bridgewater, and in pink, you'll see areas that have both water and sewer to them currently, and in blue, you'll see areas that are just water, served by water. So you can see there's a fairly largeable portion of town that only receives water, meaning they're not connected to sewer currently, and they have some version of an on-site system to treat their wastewater at the present. So when we look at the fact that majority of the town, maybe not majority, but a large portion of the town is unsewered, generally like to try to see if we can bring those towns onto sewer, and if that's something that is even necessary. So looking back at prior planning efforts that were done for the town of Bridgewater, 8 needs areas, or neighborhoods, if you will, have been identified as possibly being in need of being connected to sewer. So you see Hayward Street area, Whitman Street, Lakeside Drive, Goodwater Way, Norland Park, Dundee Drive, Atkinson, and Bayberry Circle. So these 8 areas were where we focused our initial evaluation on determining whether or not these areas were indeed in need of some sort of change to the way that they're currently treating their wastewater, which is currently using on-site systems. So again, bear with me with the map. It's a little bit busy, but if you can see in the streets that are highlighted in orange are those where sewer is available, and yellow is then those parcels that are connected to sewer. And in the red and gray areas, mostly red, those are where those 8 needs areas are listed within the town. So there's a couple to the northeast portion of town, and then the majority are to the west and southwest. So looking at these needs areas, we then went ahead and tried to propose some solutions. And in proposing those solutions, do a brief analysis of which of those solutions make the most sense. So the things that we looked at included connecting those needs areas to sewer and sending that sewer to the existing wastewater treatment facility, connecting that and perhaps sending it to a new wastewater treatment facility, perhaps to a regional system composed of systems brought together, Bridgewater and surrounding communities, potentially construct cluster or shared systems within those neighborhoods, perhaps reevaluate and change some on-site system management programs in those neighborhoods, or possibly even take no action if there was no immediate or driving need to connect to the sewer presently. So we'll, later in the discussion, we'll talk more about those needs areas, but like we evaluate the needs areas for the properties in town, we also evaluate the needs areas at the existing wastewater treatment facility in Bridgewater. So the three main drivers in changes at the wastewater treatment plant in Bridgewater. One of them is to meet capacity needs, to make sure that they can handle the volume of flow that's going to be sent in from all over the town, from those needs areas potentially, but also from the existing sewered areas in town. Michael mentioned this in his introduction, but to meet discharge limits that are determined by the NPDES, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit. That's what the town uses to be able to send their discharge to the town river. And then, like most kind of upgrade projects, is looking at the actual facilities and systems at the wastewater treatment facility to see if they need to be modernized in order to restore useful service of the equipment that's currently on site. So specifically, when we look at the capacity in terms of whether or not there's going to be a need for increased capacity at Bridgewater, we of course start with looking at what the current flows are to the site. So you can see in those top two rows, essentially look at what the existing flows are from the typical neighborhood sewered parcels, but then also looking at existing flow that is contributed from Bridgewater State University. And that together makes up about 1 million gallons in terms of what's currently flowing to the wastewater treatment plant. And then in terms of looking at the future, we wanted to provide a range of what future flows could possibly look like in the next 20 years. So we looked at items like future flow from properties that are in those sewered areas with the kind of immediate ability to connect. For whatever reason right now they haven't connected, but they have the ability to presently. We looked at future flow from simply a population increase within the already sewered areas, future flow dictated by housing developments that are plant housing developments, future flow from redevelopments and new developments that could perhaps come about in the next 20 years, as well as future flow from specifically Bridgewater State University, and then those needs areas from those neighborhoods that are not currently currently sewered, but potentially will be within those 20 years. So you can see the range of future flows. There's an increase from 1 million gallons per day now to potentially 1.2 to 1.5 million gallons in the future. So we look at that in terms of capacity, and then have to think about what changes need to be made at the wastewater treatment facility to accept those flows. The second kind of main driver of potential changes at the wastewater treatment site is looking at the, excuse me, ahead of myself. So looking at those capacity increases, we then came up with a list of potential alternatives like we did for the needs areas. So what changes could we possibly make to be able to increase capacity? So we looked at the potentially discharging to surface waters, discharging to to adding groundwater discharge at the site or adjacent to it, potentially reusing water that has been treated at the site, as well as partnering opportunities with private developments and potentially the MCI Bridgewater site. Like I mentioned earlier, that inflow and infiltration, which is flow that gets into the wastewater treatment collection system that's not sewer, that comes in from rain, that comes in from illegal connections. So there's always an effort to try to reduce those flows coming into the system, as well as trying to conserve water upstream and having less water go down the drains, if you will. So what I was saying before, if you look at the changing permit conditions at the site, this is a major driver for potential changes at the treatment facility. And so you can see on this chart, there's a few discharge parameters that are listed, as well as what the permit limits used to be, what the permit limits currently are, and for the future, for the foreseeable future. There are changes. And so what the NIPD's discharge permit is it's what allows the wastewater treatment facility to discharge their treated water into the town river. And so in order for them to continue to discharge that treated water, they have to be able to meet these permit requirements. So I'll draw your attention to towards the bottom. The main changes that we focused in on are nutrients. So that's looking at total phosphorus and total nitrogen. And you can see from the prior permit limits to the new permit limits, they've decreased. And so it's a little bit more stringent. And in order for the treatment facility to meet these new requirements, there will need to be changes in the process. So like we did for all of the other needs, we looked at potential alternatives to try to meet these new nutrient limits. So in doing that, we screened technologies and screened a fair number of technologies. But when we were going through those technologies, there were a few key considerations that we had in mind in terms of which alternatives to move forward with a more detailed evaluation. So of these considerations, we always want to look at the process reliability and whether or not they will actually truly reduce the nutrient loading to be able to meet the new permit requirements, whether or not it's feasible to actually construct those new technologies and the operability of those. Of course, cost effectiveness, and then the ability to protect the quality of the current solid waste biosolids that come off the process currently. So won't get into too much detail on this slide, but we were able to kind of narrow our alternatives for treatment at the wastewater facility, treatment facility, down to three main treatment options that we further evaluated in a more detailed capacity. But all of these three were determined based on their ability to meet those nutrient removal requirements from the new NIPD's permit. And they all involve either maintaining a current process, but adding some tankage, adding some treatment capacity, or replacing the existing process, and also kind of changing the staging and the treatment train of what's currently there. So as I said, in looking at what those treatment processes, what we would move forward with, we then continued to evaluate whether or not which was the most constructible, how easy it would be to actually phase construction on the current wastewater treatment facility site. We reviewed hydraulic profile requirements and general planning level costs in order to evaluate the best alternative to move forward with in terms of designing new treatment processes at the site. And with that evaluation, we were able to come up with a recommended plan of what changes to be made. There's a fair number of modifications here, many of which involve either rehabbing the current treatment process that's there now. So you'll see rehabilitating secondary clarifiers, rehabilitating solids dewatering processes, rehabilitating and modifying existing structures that are on site, but there's also a need to add some new treatment structures and processes, such as new primary clarifiers, new structures around the biological process at the RBCs, so rotating biological filters that we have on site, and of course other rehabilitation structures like the site buildings and other ancillary improvements on site. So once we kind of had that in mind, we of course had to look at the site itself. It's a little bit constrained. And so not only did we have to look at what processes would make sense in a design to actually meet the discharge requirements, but what could we feasibly put on the current wastewater treatment site in terms of a sense of staging at the actual site. So you can see here kind of the background image is what's currently on the site, and then the lightly green kind of forefront to the image are changes that would be made on site. And for anybody who hasn't been to the treatment site itself, it's located at the end of Morris Avenue. And you'd be traveling up Morris Avenue from the bottom of the slide here. You looking at that very bottom building off the road there. That's the composting facility on site. And then as you move your way up the picture here and up the road, that's the same sort of direction that the actual flow into the plant follows. You can see, obviously, the background satellite image is what's there now. Pretty constrained on site. There's not a whole lot of room. You can see that there's the river that kind of cuts across it on either side. And then you can see in the forefront shapes in green and blue, and those are the proposed changes to the site with the new design. So as we move our way up from the bottom of this, from the bottom of the slide, you can see two circles. That's two primary clarifiers that are currently existing on site, but would need some work, some replacement work. Moving our way up, you have two buildings, disinfection building, solids handling building, and then to the right you have a new administration building, parts of new administration building that would need to be built. Moving up again, you have those green triangles, which are again just some new tankage that would need to be added to the site. And then that last blue circle is adding a third secondary clarifier to the site. So there's plenty more to talk about here in terms of the design of the site and the way that the process is implemented on site. Any questions about that we can certainly answer, but for the sake of this presentation, we'll move on, just noting that the highlighted squares and circles here are where the changes would be made, are recommended to be made on site. So that kind of closes out what we're talking about at the wastewater treatment facility. If we think back to the needs areas as far as connecting new properties to sewer, we'll talk about, we had those 8 areas at the beginning. You can see on the map here, in blue highlighted, that's where that wastewater treatment facility is on Morris Avenue. But then in the pink areas, you can see needs areas that were evaluated to be in need of connecting to sewer. So we had started with eight needs areas that had been identified at prior planning efforts. And as we went through those 8, we made evaluations based on a number of factors. So you can see cost on the screen here, but we also wanted to consider the level of need of each of these areas in terms of, discharge to the environment, the level of need and discussions that had been had with the actual communities in the needs areas, and a whole slew of other factors, which led us to determine that 6 of those needs areas that had been previously identified were in true need of being connected to the sewer, which would require sewer extensions, and those are the costs that you see on the screen now. So in terms of kind of the big overarching picture of what's recommended as part of this comprehensive wastewater management plan for the town, the main kind of the big feature here that we'll continue talking about are those upgrades to the actual treatment facility. So the modified and additional equipment that need to be built there, as well as installing new instrumentation and updating some of those buildings. That's something that is driven by those new permit requirements. And so those needs are fairly immediate. So moving forward and looking at the cost of the project that's being recommended, there's a $31.2 million approximate cost associated with that. And again, those needs are fairly pressing. When we think about the sewer system expansion, those 6 areas that were highlighted on the last slide, obviously those areas have been evaluated as needing new sewer in the future. What's not clear about how soon the future is for those areas, and kind of dictated as when the need comes up, you know, as the neighborhoods themselves start having failing systems, or there's a clear need, that's when the evaluation of those sewer system expansions will come into play. So for now, we'll focus the rest of the presentation on those pressing wastewater treatment facility upgrades. So as we talk about that, we're looking at that 31.2 million cost. As far as how to pay for that, there are obviously multiple options to look at. Michael had mentioned state revolving fund financing that's available for projects that have gone through this comprehensive wastewater management plan process. There's the potential to have favorable financing through the state from that fund. And in addition to having lower interest rates on that loan, they also offer potentially principal forgiveness from the state revolving fund. And then there's DCAM options for possible funding sources as well. Those are 3 options. There's also the possibility of increasing sewer rates. And for that, I will turn it over to Anthony Salmonti, the Finance Director, who I think might still be muted. Not sure if that's something I can. Michael, that might be something you have to do. I know I can ask to unmute, but.
Sure, let me,
Oh, there you go.
whoops, okay, there we go, sorry.
I finally found the button and I went to unmute, and then we were in contradiction of one another. Thank you very much, Gina. So as Gina alluded to, there's 4 components to financing. One, you know, what we're going to be able to borrow at low interest with state revolving, what we would receive potentially as principal forgiveness, and another funding source is Division of Capital Asset Management and Maintenance. That's the state, and that would correlate to the Bridgewater University, whether or not we would be able to obtain some funds from them. So as I go through this, what I'm going to cover is, you know, the impact that the user rates could see depending upon the financing options that were shown in the slide before, state revolving, depending upon what the funding we are able to achieve from the state revolving, principal forgiveness, and the Division of Capital Asset Management. So as I go through the next few slides, we'll refer to having a minimum impact, a moderate impact, or a maximum impact, and that's all depending upon the other 3 funding sources. Next slide. So it's important to note, as it relates to user charges for discharging of the waste to the sewer system, that the town of Bridgewater has a tiered system. So the rates that they charge are dependent upon the amount of discharge per quarter that are recorded on the bill, and in fact are billed to the residents. Tier 1 is the lowest rate, and you'll see the rates that are currently in effect when we go to the next slide. Tier 2 has a higher rate, and Tier 3 has a higher rate than Tier 2 or 1. So in Tier 1, we have in our study, we showed what that means is on their typical quarterly bill, they would see less than 1,500 cubic feet, which is part of the mathematical equation per quarter. And that number there then is multiplied times your tier 1 rate, and that would be what your bill would equate to for the discharge portion of the bill. And then 30% of the users are in tier 2, and that's the medium residential. And they typically average between 1,501 to 3,000 cubic feet per quarter. And then tier 3, 16% multifamily, residential, commercial, institutional, so forth. Their bill would typically show greater than 3,001 plus cubic feet per quarter. Now, as you can see, if you add tier 1 and 2, that represents 84% of all users. It's interesting to note that tier 3, when you factor their rate structure for that grouping, they will pay for 80, that equates, to 80% of the revenue generated from the billing system or from the users. So 80% of the annual revenue is generated by 16% of the users. The remaining 20% of the revenue is generated from 84%. That is why there is a tiered system and a tiered rate depending upon the capacity that you use of the sewer system. So the repayment scenarios, that's the next section below here, 3 repayment scenarios: minimum, moderate, maximum impact. I alluded to the funding mechanisms. And these also are impacted by the grant and loan availability. The rate increases that you're going to see in the minimum, moderate, and maximum impact will all change under each one of those scenarios in 2022. And depending upon the other 2 scenarios, you may see a 2025, 26, or 27 additional increase. So we can move to the next slide. So in the next slide, in this example with the minimum impact, which really says we're going to be able to make available all those other funding options, and they're going to be maxed out as described on the prior slide. This has a minimum impact for repayment from the user rates. So currently, our rate schedule for tier 1 is 0.0243 cents per 100 cubic feet of discharge. Tier 2 is 0.0479 cents, and tier 3 is 0.0069 cents. Under this scenario, there would be a rate increase in 2022, going left to right, and in 2025. And if you follow from 2022 down, you can see how those rates will increase by tier, what the new rates would be, and then in 2025, you'd see what the new rates would be at that point in time. If you go to the box next to the rate schedule increasing the annualized impact, the current bill for tier 1, annualized impact, the annualized cost is 87. The annualized cost for those in tier 1 and 2 is 263, and the annualized cost for a typical user in these categories is $2,921. You can see in the next column what the increase would be, and this is the increase for the 2022 change. This slide does not show the 2025 change. The increase to tier 1 would be 150 annually, 346 for tier 2, and 3,833 for tier 3. And the following column shows you what the new annual bill would be. The next box below where it says annual repayment from rate, What that's saying is the debt service for 2022 through 2027, those are the millions of dollars that are necessary each year to pay for the debt service from the user rates. And that would be $1,290,000 in 2022 up to $1,800,000 in 2027. So this is considered the minimal impact, as we are going to maximize all those other funding mechanisms and therefore minimize the impact on the user rates. The next slide refers to the moderate impact. And what you would see is there's a larger increase in the what the typical bill would be in for tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And you can see the revenue required in 2022 being $1.5 million to fund debt, and in 2027, $2,100,000. So you can see the new annual bill would increase accordingly in the box above under annualized impact from 207 to 6,905 for the moderate impact. And that suggests some of the funding we receive from DCAM, from the SRF, principal forgiveness, and some of the rate benefits as described on the prior slide. We can go to the last, which is your maximum. And in this case, I won't go into all the details, but I will move across, and the increase to tier 1 is 166 annually, 500 for 1 and 2, and 5,549 for tier 3 user. In this case, we receive less of the benefits for other funding sources, and our debt payment in 2022 from user rates is $2,100,000, and in 2027 is $2,900,000. So that shows you the minimum, the moderate, and the maximum impact that we anticipate on the sewer user rates. We can move to the next schedule, which gives you, I think, a context. I mentioned earlier those users that are in the 3,001 plus cubic feet, which incur, we labeled here on the right where it says 1, 2, and 3. So if we look at the current bill, averaging, typical bill 2,921, under the new minimum in the average bill, we're talking 6,754. And the new moderate, 6,905, and then in the new max, 8,470. So this depicts that those users in the high usage category, that's where, as I referenced, 80% of the revenue is generated. If you go back over to the left side of the graph in tier 1, you can see the impact in a graphic form: current rate, new min, new mod, new max, and then in the moderate, new current bill, min, moderate, and max. And go to the next slide. So there's the annualized impact of the bill. Just another way of depicting the impact on the bill itself for the tier 1 and 2 and just tier 1. We took out tier 1, 2, and 3 so that this could be more easily read by those in attendance today. So it's just clearer as it points to the increase the average customer bill. And we'll move to the next slide.
Great. Thanks, Anthony.
Gina, you're welcome.
So just one last kind of slide here to wrap up the process for the comprehensive wastewater management plan. Now that we've just about finished it, we've completed several items related to it. So funding for the wastewater treatment facility upgrades have already been appropriated. They were in May of 2019. The wastewater treatment facility has already done some demonstration testing with possible treatment technologies, and the an environmental notification form and certificate, which is required from the MEPA office for projects of a certain size in the state of Massachusetts from a public facility, has been submitted and accepted. So those items have already been completed. There are a few that are still remaining, including this public meeting, this public hearing. So any comments questions and comments that we receive today or within the next 2 weeks, we will incorporate into our final draft of the CWMP and make any sort of changes that may come from those comments. And once we've done that, we will go ahead and publish the final CWMP for use by the town in the next couple of decades. So with that, I believe we'll open up the floor to questions and comments. Michael had mentioned at the beginning for additional comments through the next 2 weeks. They must be received by August 4th. You can either email the town manager at bridgewatermass.org, ma.org, or you can send hard copy mail to the town of Bridgewater at the address listed on the screen. Of course, if there's anyone now that is online that would like to ask questions or comments, now would be the time.
Thank you, Gina. And certainly anybody can ask questions, written questions at this point on the presentation at the bottom of the screen where it says Q&A. You can write your question in. You can also wave electronically if you'd like to ask your question in your own voice, and I can unmute you. So we have a number of people on the call as part of the hearing, and so I don't see anybody yet either waving or submitting a written question, but I'll give it just a moment. But I will reiterate what Gina said, and anybody looking for the draft comprehensive wastewater management plan itself, you can find it Bridgewater, the website, the town's website at bridgewaterma.org, clicking on government, then public works, then water pollution control, and then finally scroll down and you'll see Bridgewater CWMP report. You can look at the 888-page report personally and in person, but obviously with the COVID constraints that we are all living with, that you will have to schedule an appointment, and you can schedule that appointment by calling my office, town manager's office, at 508-697-0919, or you can certainly email, as it is there on the screen, email townmanager@bridgewaterma.org. And also, I will make note of the deadline. By the close of business on Tuesday, August 4th, we will compile all the comments we have received and make sure that Weston and Sampson and Kent and Gina have those comments. And let me just go back. I don't believe, do the panelists have any anything that might be useful for the greater good? I don't see any questions. And I don't see any of the panelists wanting to add anything. So I think that was exceptional, and I appreciate your time and effort and work, Gina and Kent, and we thank you for that. And one last check. I don't believe I see anybody. So with that, I will close this portion of the hearing. And as I say, we'll leave it open for public comment until Tuesday, August 4th. 2020 at 4 p.m. And you can see the ways to comment if you want to make additional comments. All right, so I think at 5:48 we will close the Zoom call. But again, thank you to all the participants and thank you to the presenters, especially Tony and Gina who carried the load on this. I appreciate it. And
Thank you.
Thanks,
with
Michael.
that, no
Thank
problem.
you, folks.
All right, thank you
Thank
very
you, Ken.
much.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.